Hi there, I recorded this tutorial as part of the Bubble Crash course, which is a new course me and my friend Pablo have just released. The idea of the course is to take you from a Bubble beginner to being able to make almost anything you want to, and this tutorial formed part of that. So I hope you find it useful, and if you do, please check out the course which is linked below. Thanks. Right, so let's talk about databases. Bubble is amazing because not only are you getting the front end side of things, which is what the users see and they interact with, but you are also able to control the database without having to set anything up, without having to go and understand what like a Postgres SQL database is. I have no idea. It's all within Bubble, and you can see on the tabs on the left hand side you've got designs, which is how things look. You got workflows, which is how things work and what actions you take, and then you've got data, which is essentially where you store all the information in your app. Almost every kind of app will have data that needs to be stored. Certainly if you want to have things like users or you want users to be able to store information or receive information or manipulate information, you almost always will need some kind of database. So Bubble comes with the database completely set up when you start, and the first thing, the only thing you'll get when you set up a database or when you set up a new Bubble project is a user, and that's already created for you. And a user is someone who can log in to your app. So you already have the sign up, the login and the sign out processes already done by Bubble. So if someone signs into your app, they will have to do it with their email, which is kind of their unique identifier for that user. And the only fields you will store about that user are these ones here. So I have actually built a recreation of the Bubble database layout to help you understand, or to help me understand and explain. But if we look back here, so Bubble has two things. It has data types. So data types are things like users, they're things like, they can be things like tweets, they could be things like properties, they could be things like to-dos, they could be things like shopping list items, and then there are fields for that data type. So for example, for user, we've got email. We could add 50 things down here, which would all be attributes of this user that we want to capture. So it could be their name, it could be their age, it could be their height, it could be their address, it could be, their interests, all kinds of things. Anything we want to know about the user, we need to create a new field within which to store that information. And when we create a field, so say we're going to create something like their height, we also need to specify what kind of information do we want to store in this field. So it can, more often than not, it will be text, because if it's height, you may want to say, like, people to type in like I'm 6 foot, or they might want to say I'm 1.81 meters. And if they're all putting in different formats, then you might want to store it as text. But if you are intending on actually using that data for something other than just displaying it back, so say you wanted to compare people's heights, then to make it easier for you to compare it, you may want to say put it in a certain format. So put it in as a number, and it has to be your height in centimeters. And in that case, you could easily compare people's heights. And then there's other types such as dates, yes or no. And these are really just helping Bubble to determine how it should treat this data. So I will give you an example. So let's say, for example, we are building a Airbnb clone. Okay, so for our app, we would need a type called user. These are all the people that are going to be able to log into the app. And on the user, we're going to want their email address. So I'm going to create a new data field for their email, and I'm going to call it, it's going to be a text field, because email addresses are generally text, and that doesn't mean it can include numbers. Text also includes numbers. It will include symbols like the @ symbol. So types user, and the field we have is email. We might also want to store their location just for their profile page, and that's going to be text as well. We might want to store something about a little bio, which will just be a short bit of text. So let's say a basic user is going to have this information. We can ask it from them when they sign up. Now, if it's Airbnb, you're also going to want to have properties. So I'm just going to create a type called property. So this is a completely new type. Just like the user, you can specify what data you want to collect from it. So a property is not going to have an email address, and it's not going to have a bio, so I won't be creating those, but I can think of all the things that I would want to store about a property. So that would be, for example, its address and its description and let's say number of bedrooms. So this is going to be an integer or a number because we will want to compare that between properties, and we want people to be able to filter, like I want property with more than 3 bedrooms. So to make that easier, we'll store it as a number. And what else? Let's say price. So we have price, we could price per night, and we'll call that's going to be a number as well, because we'll want to compare that. So now we've got properties and we've got users within our database, and this is, you know, exactly how you would set it up in Bubble, and it is really that easy just to create these things. But the key question is, are you going to link these two together? Because at the moment they are completely separate things, which is completely fine if you want to have a site where a user can log in and then they can just browse through properties and then not do much with them. But if you want a user to be able to sign up and then actually add their own properties and have a property that they are managing within your site, then you will want to create a relationship between these two things. And the way to do that is one of the things that people often have questions about, because there's a couple of ways you can do it. Now, the first thing, the most common way to do it, and the way you really should do it every time, is that the subordinate object, so in this case the property, because it is owned by a user, or at least managed by a user, so the subordinate object should have a link back to its owner, or the primary object. So in this case, that means on the property object, I will add a field called user. Okay, but instead of calling it user, I'm going to just make it a bit clearer for myself. I'm going to call it owner. But the type here is not going to be text or integer or date or any of the other ones that Bubble gives you. It's actually going to be the user type itself. So this, instead of assigning it one of these, I'm going to assign it user, which is a data type in itself. And you can see that here. So this way, that means when I create a property in the database, I can assign it to a user directly. So that means if I'm looking at this property and I want to know who the owner is, I will then have access to all of this information, email, location, and bio, about this user, because they are linked. Now, I could have alternatively linked it by putting something like, see, owner's email address, and put that as text. Okay, so this is kind of a way to link it. So owner's email address, and then it could look up the email here, but it's quite inefficient, because that means that I would have to find the property and then I'd have to search the database for someone whose email address matches the one that's here, and then I would find the user. So it makes much more sense to link it directly to the user type, which is what I'm doing here. So I'm going to delete this one. So the other question that people have is, should I also put a link to the property on the user? So for example, I could say property, and the type here would be property, and I put that on the user. So this means a user signed up, they have created a property in the system, and I've said this is their property, and I've tied it directly to the property object. So that's fine, that works really well. But the problem is, what if a user wants to have more than one property? So Many users on Airbnb will manage several properties, and you don't want them to be restricted to just having one property on their list. So in that case, you could say user has property, but I'm going to make it a list of properties. So in that case, you could have a list of properties connected to a user, and also on each property they would be connected back to that user. So the benefit of doing things this way is, it's easiest to see if I show you what you would do within Bubble to actually extract that data. So if you have the properties listed, or it doesn't have to be properties, it could be tweets, it could be any other thing that the user has created lots of or multiple of. If you have them attached to the user like this, it means that when you are searching for something in Bubble, so say this is a group or a repeating group, you could say type of content is going to be property, and the data source is going to be current users properties. Okay, so this would return you a list of all this user's properties. Now the other way, if you didn't have this on here, so you just had a user and property tied back to the user using this owner field, in that case, to find out what properties a user owns, you would have to say do a search for type property again, but in this case you'd have a constraint which would be where the owner equals the current user. Okay, so this is going to search through the whole database, but it's going to specifically be looking for properties where the owner is the current user. Whereas this one here, you've already loaded on the page, you've already loaded the current user's data object. So getting a list of their properties would just be one step further. It wouldn't actually need to do a query of the whole database because it's already done it. Now, but the downside of doing it this way is that every time you load this user and their information onto a page, so say a user's gone to their profile page, every time you load this user, it is going to load the entire list of their properties. That doesn't mean it will load all the information about the properties, but it will load an entire list of their properties in terms of the unique IDs of each one. And if the properties are only 2 or 3 or 4, that's fine, it won't take long. But if you can envisage that a user might get over 50 or 100 properties, which I'm sure does happen with some kind of companies that manage properties on Airbnb, then this starts to be quite inefficient, because every time you load the page and load something about the user, say you just wanted to get the user's email or their location, you would then have to load all this data, which would mean the page starts slowing down. So in general, the rule is you should always do it this way. So always have the subordinate object linking back to the primary object, and on occasion, if it's your preference, you can link the actual primary object with a list of things that are subordinate to it. But don't do it if you think the number of things on that list is going to be large, so above 100, and generally don't do it unless there's a reason for doing it. So if you're not going to be accessing that data regularly, then it might just be causing unnecessary kind of loading time on your page if you have it on the object itself. So another question you might ask yourself about the database of an Airbnb, say you have something else like reviews. So a property is going to have reviews. The question is, do I make it into another data type of reviews, or should I just have a list of reviews as kind of a text field on the property object itself? Because, you know, having another data type, does that seem like overkill? Now the answer is, if reviews for the property is only going to be something where you want to gather one piece of information, say the actual review itself, and it's just text, then yes, you could have it as a field on the property like this. And you could have it as a list. So you could actually have a list of different texts for the reviews. But the downside of doing anything like this is that you can only store the single piece of information about each review on here. It would only be the body of the review. So you could not store the date or time it was left. You could not store who wrote the review. You could not store anything like a star rating. So if you want to store more information on something than just one piece of data, so for example, number of bedrooms, that is an integer, it's a number. But if you wanted to store information about each bedroom, you would have to make a separate data type. So instead of that being there, you would have review, and within review you would have body, which is the text of the review. You might have title, you might have star rating, and I'll make that an integer, so it could be like 1 to 5 rating. You might have created date, which Bubble will automatically do, so you wouldn't actually have to create that yourself. And you might have approved, and this would be, I didn't add it here, but this would be a yes no field probably. So you could have like a member of staff approving whether they want reviews to be shown or not. And then finally you would also have a property field, because reviews are going to be written about a property, so you want to know which property that is. And so that means on the property page you could have a repeating group which is searching the database for reviews where the property, I'll do it here, so type, I want to find reviews, and I want it to be property is equal to current page property. Okay, so if you've got a page for the property and the page knows what properties you're looking at, which it will do, then you would look for reviews where the property is equal to the current page is property, and that would return you a list of all the reviews. So that's like a totally fine way of doing things. You may say, oh, it's unlikely this property is going to get more than 100 reviews, so I'm going to add onto the property, I'm going to add a reviews field, which is a list of reviews, and it's a list. So you could also do it that way, but as we said, there's no real reason to do that, and it's actually generally more efficient and faster to do things this way, because you may want to have like a carousel of properties on the front page of your website that only shows like a photo of the property and like the price and the location, and you don't really want to be loading the list of all the reviews, which may well exceed 100, just so you can make that carousel work. So to keep it efficient, I would say remove that. And then, reviews are linked to properties, properties are linked to users, so you could, if you want, find reviews that are linked to this user, in which case you'd probably do a search for reviews where let's see, reviews where property equals, and then within that you would have do a search for properties that where the owner is this user. So you'd have like a nested search, a search within a search, and that's one way of doing it. So what else would you want on an Airbnb? So you would also want something called rentals, right? So you want people to be able to rent properties. So let's create a new data type called rentals. And within that, you would want to store a fair amount of information. So you would need to know what property the person is looking to rent. you would need to know the start date. You would need to know the end date. You probably want to know the price paid. And you would also want to know the person renting. So that's going to be a user. And you might want to know what else, say number of guests. And maybe status, which could be a text. So this means if a user logs into the website, even if they're a user that is an owner of a property, so they're renting out their own property on Airbnb, but they log in and they decide, I want to rent somewhere for a short holiday. So they browse through all these properties that are owned by other users, and they decide, I want to rent this property, and they click, apply to rent it. So this will create a new rental within the database. So you'll have a workflow that does all this, and it will say, oops, I didn't mean to make end date equal to a property. That should be a date. Let's do that. So they'll put in their start date and their end date, and then they might submit that for approval by the owner. And so the status there, you can choose whatever words you want to represent your statuses, as long as you're consistent, but it could be kind of pending approval, could be the status, and they would have input their number of guests they wanted, and the price would presumably be calculated just based on the number of days and the daily price for that place. And then you can have it so it sends an email to the owner of the property. So it would look at the property and it would go to the property and it would look at who is the owner, and then it would get their email address from that, and it would automatically send them an email to say, are you okay with this person renting a property? And then they would click yes, and that would change the status to approved, and that would then trigger an email which would find the renter, and they're a user, so it would look at their user and it would get their email address, and it would send them an email to say you have been approved. And then you could change the status to accepted, and then afterwards you could change it to paid, and so on. Okay, let's look at another example. So say you're doing a job board. Okay, so a pretty simple kind of website. On a job board website, you want people to be able to log in, you want them to be able to post jobs, and you want other people to be able to log in, and you want them to be able to apply for jobs. So you would have a user field, as always, so that people can log in. But on each user field, you might also have a role. And the role would be a simple text field. And again, you can use any kind of descriptive terms you want as long as you're consistent, but you might have a role where someone is a job poster or a manager or kind of a corporate, and you might have a role where someone is an applicant. And of course you might have roles where someone can be both, although perhaps it's fairly unlikely that someone's going to be posting jobs whilst also applying for other jobs. Who knows? And then you're going to have a job object, because each job is going to have lots of different information you want to store about it. So you might want kind of job title, a description, the salary of the job, the date it was posted, and then you would have who it was posted by. So that way, when it's posted, both who posted it, but also this user, you could give them the ability to log back in and see all the jobs they posted and make changes to them or remove them from the site if they've been already taken. And then you can have applications. So applications will be submitted by other users, but only users who've got a role which is applicant, for example. And so they might have a cover letter, which I put here as text, but really it would probably be a file that's uploaded. So you could change this to file within Bubble. One of the data types is file. So they'll have a cover letter, a resume. You would want to store the date they submitted it, and you can have the status. That shouldn't be date, that should be text, but the status could be, again, things like pending, or it could be rejected or approved, or rejected or hired or invited for interview. So you could store all that information as a status on the application object, and then you would want each application to be linked back to the job that it's associated with, because then you can access all the information here. You could see this job has 10 applications. You can easily do a count, something like that. And then you would also want the user who has done the application. So this again would be user, but you could rename that something like applicant just to make it clearer. But it would be tied back to this user. So if they did, for example, get a message from the person who posted the job, you would then be able to look back at their user object and send them an email to say that they've been accepted for an interview.